So tonight's topic, or tonight's speaker, is someone who has probably been the most frequent visitor at VBM now that I think of it. Not probably, I can't think of anyone else who would come close. A regular, and part of that is, primarily that is due to his scholarship and talent as an educator and thinker. And also because of my warm affection for him and his inclusive, pluralistic, and deep learning style. And so it's really a privilege to have you back. And tonight's topic, Embodied Holiness, the role of the body in Leviticus, in your Vayikra. Everyone should have a source sheet. If you don't, raise your hand and we'll get you one. And my colleague Alex is going to drop the source sheet into the chat there, so you will have that there if it's not there already. Steve Shobin, great to see you in Boston. Yes, thank you for joining from Boston, and all of you, thank you for being here. So let me briefly tell you about our speaker tonight, and then I'll hand it over to him. Rabbi David Kasher is the director of Hadar West, based in LA. He grew up bouncing back and forth between the Bay Area and Brooklyn, hippies and Hassidim. He has been, although there are people who are a combo of both in the world now, we live in interesting times, hippie Hassidim, and has been trying to synthesize these two worlds ever since. He received his rabbinic ordination at Yeshivat Chovevei Torah, YCT, in New York, and a doctorate in legal studies from Berkeley Law. He has served as Senior Jewish Educator at Berkeley Hillel, Director of Education at Kevah, and Associate Rabbi at IKAR. He's the author of ParshaNut, 54 Journeys into the World of Torah Commentary, and the host of the Torah podcast, Best Book Ever. He will be available to sign ParshaNut after. He also wrote an article in a book that is relevant to the topic tonight. So we made sure to have that book available as well, and that article if you want to go deeper on this subject. So please join me in welcoming Rabbi David Kasher.
Okay. Hi, everybody. Nice to see you all. Nice to see you here. Hello. Okay. So first of all, I have to just say the primary reason that I'm here is because Reb Shmuley is one of my best friends and people I admire most in the world. And so, I take any opportunity to fly out here and spend some time with him. And that's really the primary reason. And then it's a joy to be able to teach Torah in this community. So happy to be here and happy to be the leader in the attendance here at VBM, in-person attendance anyway. Okay, so let me just say a couple of things about my intentions tonight with this topic. I'm here to do two things, and one is to defend, redeem, celebrate, embrace the body. That's the first thing, and as the rabbi just said, it is in some ways so basic that it's easy to say, oh, well, of course the body is important, but sometimes in our tradition, it feels like the body is just what gets overlooked. I know that when I went off to study in yeshiva, I encountered a world of such profound spiritual and intellectual depth, but there wasn't a lot of talk about keeping ourselves, healthy and fit. It sometimes felt like, the body is just like the vehicle to drive the mind around, in fact, one of the references you would hear, positive references to the body, was if someone had Sitzfleisch, meaning like a sitting flesh, like a good solid butt to sit on. That's good. That's what you need, because you should sit down and study the Torah all day long. That's about the extent of what you need out of your body. It sometimes felt. And it took me years to come to understand that my relationship to my own body was a part of my spiritual life, had to be a part of my spiritual life, and that there were Jewish sources that affirmed that. And so that's some of the thinking that I want to do with you tonight, in celebration of, in embrace of the body. The other big picture goal that I have tonight is to celebrate, defend, and redeem the book of Leviticus, which is, here I am I looked at the calendar when we decided on this date, and I always look at what the weekly Parsha is, because I'm a Parsha guy, as the book title suggests. I'm a Parsha guy, and so here we are in the book of Leviticus. I have to say something about the book of Leviticus, and I think most of us have enough familiarity with Leviticus to know that it isn't the most popular book of the Torah, right? Like there's Genesis, there's Exodus. I mean, the two greatest books ever are the first two parts of this Torah that we have. How great! And then you get to Leviticus, and things get dense and complicated, and most of all, absent of narrative. That's not entirely true. There are little narratives here and there in Leviticus, but mostly it's laws, and mostly it's priestly laws, and you begin sometimes to lose the reader's attention. And so here this is this central book in our Torah, this 1 out of 5. We have to embrace Leviticus too, and I want to try to do that with you by giving you a sense of some of the patterns that are present in the book of Leviticus, some of the themes that not just appear here and there, but in a very structured way, some of the themes that get laid out in Leviticus, and to show you that actually there, in a sense, there are narratives in Leviticus, narratives that run all the way through, but they're spiritual narratives, they're conceptual narratives. And one of those narratives, and I think one that's often overlooked, is the centrality of the body in this priestly, Levitical holiness experience. And here I should just say a word about holiness. That's the other big word in my title, embodied holiness. So yes, the body will play a central role in our discussion tonight, but it's all against the backdrop of the major concept of Leviticus, the big concept of Leviticus, which is Kedusha, holiness. Holiness is the great concern of the book of Leviticus, and I might contrast it with the book of Exodus by saying the book of Exodus, the great concern is justice, right? The narrative itself is a struggle for justice, but then even the laws, we refer to that code as the covenant code, but in Hebrew, that's mishpatim. The justice laws, the just society laws, ordering society around just principles. Now we're in the book of Leviticus, we've shifted our focus to another great Jewish value. In fact, I might say the other great Jewish value, which is holiness. And the question is, what does that mean? What is holiness? Well, we'll talk about that tonight, but just to evoke the word holiness is to potentially to suggest something that is ethereal, abstract, pure spirit, having nothing to do with the stuff of this world. Holiness is something refined and rarefied and out there and having something to do with God. Holiness has nothing to do, you might say, with the muck and matter of this world. And so the case that I want to make tonight, and the case that I think Leviticus is making, is that no, holiness is very much present in the world, and not just in the way that we treat each other, but actually present in the very matter of our physical beings. Something about our actual material world and the body that we live in is essential for this quest to holiness. Okay, so that's the claim that I want to try to justify tonight. I'm going to try to take us then on a little tour through Leviticus, through this framework, and I'll try to make the case, and then we'll open up and I'll be curious to hear what you think and if you've got additions or critiques or pushback. But let me try to take you through the book of Leviticus with an eye on the body and the appearances of the body in Leviticus. One last thing before I do that, and here you can start to look at these source sheets that I have given out. Let's just think for a moment before we dive into Leviticus about holiness, Kedusha, so far in the Torah. Where have we seen holiness so far in the Torah? Well, we can start by saying, where's the first place that it makes its appearance? The first thing to be designated as holy, and that is Shabbat, the seventh day. Right? The first chapter of the book of Genesis is God creating the world in 6 days, and then famously God rests on the seventh day. and blesses the seventh day, vayikadeshoto, and makes it holy, vayikadesh. Like there's that word kedusha, kadosh. Okay, so that's the first thing that is holy, or that we are aware of. We see that God can make something holy, and the first thing that God makes holy is a day, a unit of time. So time can, as Heschel famously said, time can be holy. There can be holy times. Now, I want to say, and it's important to say at the outset, some of you probably have heard this before, but if you haven't, it's worth hearing, that holiness, the word for holiness, kedusha, also has the connotation in Hebrew of being set apart, set aside, distinguished, as opposed to one thing distinguished as opposed to other things. So significantly, the seventh day is made holy as opposed to the first six. Those will be, I don't know, whole. Not profane is the word, but that's not the right word. Just regular is the word. Those days will be regular. To make something holy is to take it and to give it special distinction. That's why, for example, we refer to marriage as kiddushin, because you're taking your partner and setting your partner aside and saying, "This, I have a special relationship with this person," and that's part of what makes it holy, is that I've sanctified this. I might have relationships with lots of people, but this one I have designated, and it's a holy relationship. So part of what it means to, in this tradition, in this language, for something to be holy is for it to be set aside for a special purpose and distinguished from other things. Okay, that's the first thing that we see named as holy in the Torah, and that's very early on. That's the second chapter in Genesis. Then we don't see a lot of talk about holiness for the rest of Genesis, but holiness begins to come back in the book of Exodus, and the first place that we see it in the book of Exodus is when Moses goes and looks at the burning bush and is told not to come any closer because he's standing on Admat Kodesh, on holy ground. You're standing on holy ground. So you should, take your shoes off because this ground, the place you're standing, is holy. Now, what does that mean? It's not so clear, but now we know that not only time, but places can be holy as well. And again, it has something to do with a connection to God. God designates the seventh day. God speaks to Moses and tells Moses that this particular ground, as opposed to all the ground in the world, this is designated, this is holy ground. Okay. If we move through the book of Exodus, we won't trace every appearance of holiness because that's not our task for tonight. We really want to turn to Leviticus. But if we move through Exodus, we'll see other things named as holy. Most notably, perhaps, we are introduced the idea that God is holy. In the Song of the Sea, God is described as Norah B'Kodesh, awesome in holiness. So we knew that God could make things holy, but it turns out that God itself, himself, herself, God is holy. And so now we start to understand why God could make things holy. It's some expression of what God is. Okay. And then towards the end of the book of Exodus, we start to get a new sense that not only can God make things holy, but we can make things holy as well. Okay, I have some of the language on here that's especially famous from the Ten Commandments. Zachor et Yom HaShabbat, remember the Sabbath day, l'kadsho, to make it holy. Now that one is a direct parallel, one-to-one. God made the seventh day holy. Now you can make the seventh day holy, though it may come as a surprise to us that we are also supposed to designate things as holy, that we also have the power to make things holy. Isn't the seventh day already just holy because God said so? But no, we also have the capacity, now that we have some encounter with holiness, to designate things, to sanctify things, to set them apart, just as God set apart the seventh day, so we can set apart the seventh day, and in doing so, to sanctify it, to make it holy. Okay, and then there are other things that are named as holy. The first issue of your donkeys, or the first and last days of the Passover. There are other things that are named with that language of holiness, of kedusha, but the main thing, the main holy thing in the Torah is introduced towards the end of the book of Exodus, and that is what we sometimes translate as the sanctuary, the holy place, the mikdash. Kedusha, again, is the word for holiness. Mikdash is like a holy object or a holy place, a physical, tangible thing that is holy, that embodies holiness. And we are told to make a sanctuary, to make a holy, object's the wrong word, but place is the wrong word. Also, it's some kind of structure, a holy structure. And this holy structure we are told to make, and once we make it, God will dwell among us. Okay? That's the end of the book of Exodus. That the last chapters of the book of Exodus are dealing with the construction of this holy thing, and that's where we leave off with the book of Exodus, and sets us up for our entrance into the book of Leviticus, which seems to pick up right on that note and say, okay, so we have a mikdash, we have a holy place. What do we do there? And that, you might say, is what the book of Leviticus is all about. What do we do in the mikdash? And not really what do we do, because few of the Israelites are ever going to actually enter into the mikdash. What are the priests going to do in this holy place? The priests, who again have been designated, and the high priest especially is designated with the language of kadosh LaHashem, holy to God. Right? So we've got now a book that is going to be about the holy place and the holy people who attend to the holy place, and it seems that our focus is just going to be on the particulars of this object, the workings of this holy thing, and the priests who tend to it. And in many ways, that's true. That is what Leviticus is about. But what is misleading is the impression you might have that this is all taking place in the object, in the place, by the priest, very much outside of us, very much outside of our experience. The holiness will happen in the holy space, and we will sometimes get close to it, but that's about it. We will just observe holiness from afar. Okay, but that is not ultimately where Leviticus leaves us off. So now let's head into Leviticus, and I want to start slowly and just notice some of the references to the body, to physicality, as we enter into this book of holiness, this sometimes called the Torat Kohanim, the book of the priests. So it seems at first, for the first 10 chapters of Leviticus, like, yeah, we're talking to the priests here, and we're talking about the sacrificial offerings. Very little to do with me, and certainly very little to do with my body, except that there are little signals, there are little clues that even right from the start, there's something about this system that is speaking to our physical experience. And I'd like to start us off just by looking at one phrase there. You should be have flipped the page. In the fourth verse of Leviticus, we are told that when someone brings a korban, a sacrifice, they bring it to be offered at the mikdash, and then there's this interesting detail: v'samach yado al rosh ha'olah, and the person should place their hands on the head of the animal. Place their hands on the head of the animal. That is a strikingly physical encounter with the animal, and we might just begin to riff on what the meaning is, but we certainly have to wonder, why do you touch the head of the animal? Is there some kind of transference there? Is there some kind of communication happening there? The next source here is also just as a matter of signals and clues. This is also worth noting. One of the subjects in Leviticus is the nefesh. When I say it's one of the subjects, I mean, that's a word, Rabbi just mentioned that word, our nefesh. It's one of the words that we sometimes use for our souls, our nefesh, but here it's the word is playing a different role. V'nefesh ki takriv korban mincha LaHashem. When a nefesh brings a meal offering to God, meaning nefesh has become a way of speaking about a person. And we have that in English as well. We say sometimes, no one was around, not a soul, right? Not a soul in sight. Okay, as if to say, not a person. But this is the first time that language of nefesh has been used in that way in the Torah. That is, a nefesh is now another way of referring to a person. But what is a nefesh? A nefesh is that thing that we became in Genesis when God, v'yipach ba'apav nishmat chayim, when God breathed life into us, and we became a nefesh chaya. We became a living nefesh. Okay, so our formation, our sort of transformation into a living being is our God giving us a life force, is our becoming a nefesh. And indeed, that's the way the word is used from then until this point. That is, it's used to refer to the life of a person or the life force of a person, but almost as an object, not a subject. In fact, maybe one of the famous phrasings we have in the next source here, if someone commits a crime, one of the possible punishments is nefesh tachat nefesh, a life for a life, or a soul for a soul, or a life force for a life force. Like an eye for an eye, which I spoke about last time I was here, but in this case, a nefesh for a nefesh. My point is that the word nefesh has been used all this time to refer to something important to us, but it's not a subject, it's an object, our life. All of a sudden, the Torah starts to speak about us as nefashot. We are, when we reflect on our subjectivity, we're reflecting on ourselves from the perspective of our life force, of our bodies. Okay, so that's another kind of signal there that even in the basic operation of this sacrificial system, which is what? Taking an animal, putting it on the altar, and burning it up and offering it to God, the transference that is suggested by laying our hands on this animal, the language of describing ourselves as a nefesh, suggests to us that maybe actually the body of the animal is acting as a substitute for our own bodies. Why do we offer animals to God? I mean, God doesn't eat. But in fact, many of the commentators say, Nachmanides says, that what we're doing is that we are trying to imagine that we would give up our own bodies, put our own bodies on the altar. Maybe we even deserve, if we're bringing a sin offering, maybe we deserve to have our nefesh forfeited, but instead we're putting in the nefesh of this poor animal, and Nachmanides says, "Lulei chesed abore," if not for the kindness of God who allows us to offer, not kind to the animal, but to us, who allows us to offer an animal as a tmura, as a substitute for our own bodies, then it starts to seem like, wow, maybe this whole system is a way of enacting the idea that I might put my own body on the altar as a kind of sacrifice to God. Okay, so far those are just hints, but they're hints that signal to something quite bold. This idea that our own, that by rights our own body should be offered to God. That's just a signal, but we'll try to make stronger that concept, that case. The other thing I want to say just early on in Leviticus, just these first 10 chapters where we're discussing the sacrifices, now I've framed the sacrifices as potentially some kind of bodily substitute, life for life, nefesh tachat nefesh, right? The same language that's used actually in criminal law, a life for a life, you might use to describe the sacrificial system itself, nefesh tachat nefesh, a life for a life. But that's not the only very physical thing that is happening in these early chapters. not just the bringing of the offering, but actually one of the things that we see in the second parsha, Parsha Tzav of Leviticus, and you'll see this in beginning in chapter 6 on that second page, is that what is left of the meal offering, hanoteret mimena, yochlu Aaron uvanav. Aaron and his sons eat the remainder of the meal offering. So some of the sacrifices are entirely consumed. The olah is entirely consumed on the altar. But some of them, and not just the meal offering, but as you'll see in the next source, even the sin offering. You bring a sin, you've committed a sin. You feel bad about it. You bring an animal to offer to God. It gets cut up and put onto the altar, except that the priests eat part of the sin offering. I mean, this is sort of a wild but very prominent detail in the sacrificial system. We bring this animal. Is it meant to be a substitute for our own selves, for our own life force, for our own body? That's a question that we've put out there. And now we see that, speaking of physicality, that the priests are actually consuming our offering, actually ingesting and digesting our sins. Somehow in this spiritual system, part of the process is that it must be eaten and consumed. Now, this is not, I lay emphasis on this because this is not the last eating that we will be seeing here in the book of Leviticus, but it's the first eating that we see, and it's actually, I think if we step back for a moment, it's rather odd. Of course, the priests need to eat, and so part of it is just to sustain the priesthood. But the idea that we would work, I mean, just think about it. Even our sin offerings are somehow moved through the priestly body. That's, again, I haven't yet made a strong case. I'm just noting some of the signals that, wow, this is very visceral, very corporeal, what's going on here. Okay. But that said, so far, first 10 chapters of Leviticus, we're still in a place where we might assume that this is all happening outside of us. Okay, maybe there's some kind of transference, but even so, it's at the end of the day, I give forth this offering, the priests take it, and then they do with it what they are instructed to do. And so it is that as the sanctuary, the Mikdash, is finally inaugurated in the third reading of the book of Leviticus, Parshat Shmini. On the 8th day, the sanctuary was inaugurated with the first sacrifices. It seems like this system is in place. The priests are going to deal with it. And if you look at the last source there on the second page, the priests are told, after we've just heard that they eat some of the offerings, they're told, here's what you don't eat, though, or you don't consume, is wine. You shouldn't consume intoxicants, at least not while you're working in the sanctuary, because your job, and here's the priest's job finally named. Okay, we know a lot of their duties, but this is almost like their job description. Your job is lehavdil ben hakodesh uven hachol, to distinguish between the holy and the regular, the holy and the profane, between the tameh and the tahor, the pure and the impure. Ulaharot et bnei Yisrael et kol hachukim, and you will teach the children of Israel all of these laws, all of these rites and rituals. So, very much as I have suggested, it seems like the priests are in charge. They tell you what's holy or not. They work out all the details among themselves, and they teach you about it, but you're an observer. You're watching from afar. This is about what the priests do, and you would be forgiven for thinking at this point, 10 chapters into Leviticus, that holiness is mostly a priestly matter. Okay? Then there's a huge turn. There's a big turn in the middle of Parshat Shmini, the third reading. We're 10 chapters in, and the structure that I've laid out is in place. And then suddenly in the 11th chapter, and you can turn now to the third page. I should have numbered these pages. That would have been helpful. But it says on the top, Leviticus chapters 11 through 18. There's a turn in Parshat Shmini, and it has to do with eating. Okay? And here we really start to get into thinking about our own bodies. So we set up the sacrificial system. I mean, we might well just end the book of Leviticus after chapter 10. We're done. The sanctuary is now working. Why do we keep going? Well, we do keep going for, another 17 chapters. Where are we headed? Well, it turns out the first place that Leviticus heads after describing the working of the sanctuary is into our digestive system. And that is to say that we get at the end of Parshat Shmini, in chapter 11 of the book of Leviticus, we suddenly get the first major list of the kosher laws. And the kosher laws, as described there, have mostly to do with the animals that you should eat and the animals that you shouldn't eat. And the reason that you shouldn't eat some animals is because they are not pure or tahor, and you are allowed to eat some animals because they are pure tahor. Just keep note of that binary, tahor and tameh, because it's a binary that is, remember, the priests were there to teach the difference between the holy and the profane and the pure and the impure. So there's some parallelism there. So we are suddenly told, and why are we being told in the middle of Leviticus, here's what you can and can't eat. Why does that matter? It might matter. This religion might want me to have some dietary laws, but what's it doing in the middle of this book that is ostensibly about the sanctuary? Well, in the middle of this source here on the third page, I've bolded verse 44. We've been talking about all the things you can't eat, and you can see you can't eat things that crawl on their belly or walks on fours, all the creepy crawly things, insects, things that swarm around. And why can't you eat all of these things? Ki ani Hashem Elokechem, for I, the Eternal, am your God. V'hit kadashtem v'yitem kadoshim ki kadosh ani. You shall sanctify yourselves and be holy, for I am holy. You shall sanctify yourselves and be holy, for I am holy. Now, that phrasing is going to become very big in the book of Leviticus, going to be one of our famous phrases. We'll get to it eventually, but that phrasing actually appears for the first time in the middle of the kosher laws. You shall be holy because I am holy, and so lo titamo et nafshotechem b'chol hasheretz haromes al haaretz. So you shall not make yourselves impure through any swarming thing that moves on the earth. Okay, so you have to watch what you eat, to watch what you put in your body, because you have to make yourselves holy, because I am holy, and if you put the wrong thing in your body, you will screw that up somehow. You will not be holy. Now, what does that mean? So far, holiness has been about designating one day out of the week, or one plot of ground, or one particular structure. What does it mean that I would be holy? Well, we don't know yet, but it has something to do with watching what I eat. Okay. Now, this I just want to mention is this is the book that is out there that Rav Shmuley didn't say, but he published this book and assembled a lot of us to write essays on kashrut and on keeping kosher. And this is what the article that I wrote in there deals with this particular transition, which I think is one of the most important moments in the book of Leviticus, where suddenly we're seeing all of these priestly laws take a pause, and we start thinking about our own life and our own practice. And the first thing we think about is eating. Okay, but if that were all this was, then we would just say the role of eating in the book of Leviticus, the role of consumption in the book of Leviticus. But I called this the role of the body in the book of Leviticus because we don't stop our turn into the body with thinking about eating. The next three parshot in a row, the next three readings in a row. Parshat Shmini has the laws of kashrut, of eating. The next parsha after Parshat Shmini is Parshat Tazria, which begins Isha ki Tazria v'yalda zachar. When a woman conceives and bears a male, and then it goes on to describe the rituals around birth. First, the birthing a male and then birthing a female, they're slightly different, and that confuses the commentators, but not for now. The point is, the opening of the next reading has to do with birth and reproduction. Okay, specifically the workings of the female body. Okay, so that's interesting. We've been thinking about eating. We spent 10 chapters thinking about the sanctuary, then all of a sudden we're talking about our eating. Now we're thinking about birth. Okay, then the next parsha is Parshat Mitzorah, the laws of the, sometimes we translate it as the leper, but the person afflicted with some kind of skin ailment. In other words, the next parsha starts thinking about sickness, ailment, disease, when our bodies are deteriorating. This is the Torah that suddenly felt relevant to rabbis all over the world when we went into the COVID period. Right? Like usually we glazed over these chapters. We didn't really want to read about these skin diseases. But I hope I've at least made the case that the first chunk of Leviticus is about the sanctuary and the second chunk of Leviticus is about the body. Question is why? And where do we go from here? Now, the why of it, you might already be beginning to formulate for yourselves. The priests were taught to distinguish between the holy and the non-holy, between the pure and the impure. Now we are being taught to think about those distinctions, not necessarily to navigate them all through the priest, but actually to look inside of our own beings, to look at our own skin, look at our diet, look at even our sex lives, and to think, how can I distinguish between what is holy in this realm of my life and what is not holy in this realm of my life? So we now have a strong sense, a growing and a strong sense that the maintenance, the care, the attention to our body has something to do with holiness. The question is, what? Why is it important? What does our body have to do with holiness? And why is it important that we think of our body with respect to holiness? Okay. And now we come to really the biggest move in the book of Leviticus, the real turning point in the book of Leviticus. What I am coming to do tonight is just to suggest that there's a first turn, and the first turn is the turn inward to the body. But the big turn, the one that you didn't need me to come here and tell you about, because every rabbi talks about it every time we're reading Parshat Kedoshim, which is that famous parsha that begins, Kedoshim tiyu, you be holy, ki kadosh ani Hashem Elokechem, because I, the Lord your God, am holy. This is the holiness code. I mentioned this earlier. This in chapter 19 suddenly is another twist in the plot of Leviticus, which is suddenly Leviticus is interested in ethics. Leviticus is suddenly interested in law. Leviticus is suddenly interested in justice. It seems so far like Leviticus was interested in animal sacrifice and the maintenance of the health, well-being, purity, something of my body. But now in Leviticus, it turns out that we are being asked to be holy because God is holy. And what happens then? The rest of Parshat Kedoshim is a series of laws of all manner and variety. I mentioned earlier, the first law that we get is that you should revere your mother and father. The second law that we get is that you should watch, observe, guard the Sabbath. Where are those laws? Where do we know those laws from? From the Ten Commandments. In other words, Leviticus is saying in a very strong way, I want you to be holy. I've been asking you to think about holiness this whole time. Well, you might not have expected this, but the way that I want you to think about living out, becoming holy people and living out holiness in the world is through the laws of the Torah. So take a look there on page 4 at some of the mitzvot in that open Parshat Kedoshim there. I mentioned the reverence for mother and father and the Shabbat. Just a few verses down, we get the leaving of the peah, the corner of the field for the poor. Now, I might spend some time thinking about, there's eating again. There's like the body that, but for my purposes now, I don't even have to lay emphasis on that. That's obviously a law about compassion and tzedakah and giving to the poor. Those are justice laws. A just society takes care of its poor. You keep going and you find laws about not stealing, not cursing the deaf, or placing a stumbling block before the blind. These are basic laws about treating each other well in our society. And again, you didn't need me to come here and tell you this. This is the big reveal of the book of Leviticus, which is that it turns out that the injunction to be holiness is not just going to take place in the sanctuary. It's going to take place also in your conduct, in your society, in the way that you treat one another. Okay, but what am I here to tell you? What am I here to teach tonight? Is that it's important to note that this doesn't just come out of nowhere, this mandate to be holy through your good conduct. This is on the heels of parsha after parsha of focusing on our bodies, focusing on how we maintain and keep our bodies holy. What does that mean? Well, just before I draw the conclusion, let's take a look just a little bit further into Parshat Kedoshim there in chapter 20. This language of you sanctifying yourself and be holy, for I, the eternal, am your God. That we saw before, that phrasing we saw before earlier in Parshat Shmini when we were given the laws of kashrut. But here, there's like a kind of a summary of everything that we've been talking about. If anyone insults their mother and father, yes, we've seen that before. If anyone commits adultery with a married woman, yes, we saw those sexual ethics before. You shall separate the pure beast from the impure beast. Oh, right. We saw the kosher laws before as well. And then finally, once again, v'item li kadoshim, be holy to me, ki kadosh ani Hashem, because I am holy. Va'avdil etchem min ha'amim liot li, and I will divide you from among the peoples to be holy to me. In other words, I will designate you as a special people in the way that you designate someone when you have a relationship with them. So God will set us aside and have a relationship with us. But what does all this amount to? It means that I will be holy so that I can be in a relationship with God. And I will be holy, and that will be a way of being in relationship with God. And the way that I will do that is that I will carry out the mitzvot, the commandments. That in some ways is the big chiddush, the big insight of the book of Leviticus, which is that holiness is not just an affair of the priestly class, but actually something that we live out in the ethics of our everyday life. But what's important to remember is that in order to carry out all of these commandments, in order to go out and live ethically in the world, to leave the corner of your field, for example, the poor, in order to do any of that, you are going to need a body. And that body itself has to be maintained, its health has to be maintained, and its purity has to be maintained, because your body has to be a vessel of holiness if it will be the container for these holy actions. The sanctuary is the container for the presence of God. But your body is like a mini sanctuary, and so it too has to be a mikdash, a holy space, so that it can be the container for holy behavior. So we know, and it is one of the great hallmarks of our tradition, that Leviticus wants us to think not just about animal sacrifice, but about ethical behavior. But it's important to recognize that there's a transition. It isn't just 1 point animal sacrifice, point 2, think about being a good person. The transition is 4 parshot in a row that deal with the functioning, the health, the behaviors, the basic workings of the human body. Okay, so where then does that I've made my case, and I'd like to hear what you think about it. But I want to just I want to leave us off by taking us to the very. There's more in Leviticus. There's stuff I haven't. I mentioned the Yom Kippur ritual and sort of passing. There's stuff to talk about there. There's the Shemitah. There's lots of other. This is not a comprehensive tour of Leviticus, but hopefully it's a tour that has illuminated the prominence and the role of the body in this quest for holiness. I want to take us just through the last chapter of Leviticus. In this difficult book, of course, there's the ending is difficult too. And the last chapter of Leviticus, if you turn to the penultimate page here, you'll see that that in chapter 27, of all things, this is how the book of Leviticus ends. The Eternal spoke to Moshe saying, "Speak to the Israelite people and say to them, when any party explicitly vows to the Eternal the equivalent value for a human being, the following scale shall apply. If it is a male from 20 to 60 years of age, the equivalent is 50 shekels of silver by the sanctuary weight. If it is a female, the equivalent is 30 shekels. If the age is from 5 years to 20 years, the equivalent is 20 shekels for a male and 10 shekels for a female. If the age is from 1 month to 5 years, the equivalent for a male is 5 shekels of silver, and the equivalent of a female is 3 shekels of silver. If the age is 60 years of old, the equivalent is 15 shekels in the case of a male and 10 shekels for a female. But if one cannot afford the equivalent, that person shall be presented before the priest, and the priest shall make an assessment. The priest shall make the assessment according to what the vower can afford." Why are we talking about this? And also, how ghastly that we are evaluating, in this age where we have come to formulate a strong critique of evaluating the worth of a human being and selling a human being as if on the slave market. What is Leviticus doing here? Well, the law that is being described is your ability to use the slave trade, the open market, to evaluate your worth, but not so that you would sell yourself, but so that you would devote the worth of your being, of your corpus, to the temple. So you could actually appear before the priest and say, "I am a middle-aged man in good health, and this is how much I would fetch on the open market. I take that value and I devote it as an offering to the temple." Now, why is Leviticus thinking about this? Why is Leviticus dealing with this very almost commodifying relationship to my person and to other people? Well, it turns out that the chapter goes on to say, if you have animals and you want to devote them to the temple, these are the ways that you price and evaluate an animal that you would devote to the temple. If you have a plot of land and you want to devote the land to the temple, this is how you would devote the value of land to the temple. This is how you would sanctify, in other words, a plot of land, or how you would sanctify the body of an animal. So it turns out that what Leviticus is saying is, you should think of your own body the way that you think of your property, as something that can be taken and consecrated, made holy, and devoted to God. You should think of your own body as something that you could put in the service of God, and that's what would make your body holy. Okay, and just look at the last line on that page. All that anyone owns, be it human or beast or landholding, nothing that has been prescribed for the eternal may be sold and redeemed. Every prescribed thing is totally consecrated to the eternal. So we started off talking about animals and how animals could be given over to God. But the way that the book of Leviticus ends is by saying it isn't just animals that can be given and devoted to God. It isn't just land and property, but it is your own body, your own actual being that can be devoted to God. And the way that you do that this particular imagery asks you to think, what would it be like if I actually was worth a certain amount? Could I devote that amount to God? But the truth is, the primary way that we've been asked to devote our bodies to God is by purifying them through good health and good conduct. That is the way that we devote our bodies, our beings to God, is by giving at least a portion of our physical beings over to God as a kind of an offering. And I'll just close by saying one of the last lines in the book of Leviticus, one of the last lines on the page here, is quite striking. V'chol maaser bakar v'tzon kol asher yavor tachat hashevet, all the tithes of the herd or the flock, all that passes under the shepherd's staff, every tenth one, asiri, yeh Kodesh Lashem. The 10th one shall be holy to the eternal. That image of every sheep that passes under the shepherd's staff, that's like this chapter that began with us thinking about our own bodies being given over to God, ends by saying every sheep of the flock, the 10th one, will be given over to God. That image is then taken up by first the Mishnah, the rabbinic code that says that on Rosh Hashanah, all of us pass before God like sheep, and then is elaborated in the famous prayer Unetanit Tokef, which uses exactly that language. Just as a shepherd herds his flock, Hamavir Tzono Tachat Shifto, directing his sheep to pass under his staff, so you shall pass, count, and record the souls of all living, and decree a limit to each person's days, and inscribe their final judgment. That language of like passing under the shepherd's staff is taken directly from the end of Leviticus, because I think that on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, our rabbis wanted to remind us of this paradigm that Leviticus offers us, where we might actually devote our actual beings, our actual bodies to God in the way that the sacrifices have created a kind of substitute for that. The truth is, ultimately, what the Leviticus is trying to get us to is not to focus on the substitute, but the actual devotion of ourselves, of our physical selves, our very bodies to God. Okay, what does that mean? Well, I think, just in terms of implications, I think two things. One, it means that I actually ought to think about how my body is being used in service of holiness. How? Maybe it's through mitzvot. Maybe it's through protests. Maybe it's by Mario Savio. I'm from the Bay Area. Said sometimes you have to throw your body into the gears of the machine. Sometimes you have to actually stand up for something. Use your body as a kind of an actual agent of holy service. But sometimes it's much more simple. I will need a body in order to carry out most of the mitzvot in the Torah. There are mitzvot that can be carried out in your mind, like believing in God, but most of the mitzvot will require a body, and I have to keep that body healthy and pure and safe in order to carry out the mitzvot. So one thing is just to be thinking, how can I devote my body to God? Is that a thought that you've had before? Like that's one thing that I want to leave you with. And the other thing that I want to just say is that this account of Leviticus also forces us to think about something that we don't think about often enough in this tradition, which is exercise and health and well-being. And that is an area that you might go a long time in Jewish studies without ever thinking too seriously about. But I think that although Leviticus's conclusion has to do with a kind of devotion of the body to God, along the way it's clear that part of what that involves is having a good, healthy, well-tended to body. And so it must be the case that part of our religious mandate, part of our spiritual life, has to be to go for a jog, to eat healthy, to be, careful about contracting illnesses. This too is a part of our spiritual lives, and this too we will need to attend to if we are going to be in relationship with the holy. Okay, I want to leave it there, and I want to ask you. I think I'm at just about time, so that's good. If there's okay, so I'll take questions now or thoughts or some unconvinced, convinced, other theories. And you can chat your questions or thoughts into the chat, and I'll respond.
Thank you, Rabbi. That was extremely interesting. Just an analogy, doesn't our tradition also say that we should not take excessive risks with our lives, like parachuting if you don't have to, and don't risk your life for the adrenaline thrill?
Yes, that's right.
I see that as a respect for the body as well.
You're
speak on that?
Yeah, you're exactly right. You have added an essential component to this conversation about the role of the body in the Torah. Shmor ma'od et nafshotechem. Guard your there's that word again, your nefesh, your life force, your body. And you're right, that is the actual official source for what I'm saying is often overlooked in Jewish tradition. The idea that you actually have to mind your health has an official location point, and it isn't in Leviticus, it's in Deuteronomy. My point tonight was just to say we can see that attention to and care. You might just think it was like one phrase in Deuteronomy, but actually a lot of the work of Leviticus is setting that up. But you're exactly right. If you want a real landing place for that principle, that's the verse you're turning to.
Thank you.
Yeah, exactly right. Exactly right.
The business of substitution was foreshadowed, if you will, in Isaac.
Yeah, that's right. That's exactly right. That's I'll just say out what you're referring to. This idea that Isaac that God commands Abraham to sacrifice Isaac, and at the last minute, Abraham is stopped from slaughtering Isaac and instead lifts his eyes and sees a ram, which Abraham offers in place of Isaac. So the idea, you're exactly right. You don't have to do the kind of fishing into the subtleties of the language of Leviticus to get the sense that actually from the very start, the idea that an animal could be offered in place of me offering my own body on the altar, that's exactly right. Do you want to say anything more about it? Just that sets up the paradigm.
I was also thinking of the on Friday nights when we bless our children, we put our hands on them also.
Yes, right. That idea of like the laying of the hands, such a physical act, but we do have, in this tradition that we often, since Maimonides, we tend to think of this tradition as like very much like conceptual and cerebral, but there's something very visceral, very, very physical about some of the rituals that we have in the laying of hands. We don't do that with rabbis anymore, but you're right that we have preserved that tradition in the way that we bless our children. And that's quite powerful. The idea that, whether it's literally or metaphysically or metaphorically, it's hard to say, but there's some way in which when I place my hands on your head and I bless you, it is as if that blessing is flowing through me into you, through our physical contact. Or when I place my hands on an animal, it's as if like my regret, my yearning for forgiveness, for closeness to God, so to speak, I'm transferring that into the animal through my hands. And there's something very intensely physical about that ritual. Yeah.
So I'm interested to hear your thoughts on how we can see our bodies as vessels of holiness and mitzvot as our bodies are beginning to declining through aging. Yeah. And even more so for those whose bodies are extremely compromised through illness or accident.
Yeah, it's a good question and an important question. And here is actually where I think the Torah, which I sort of started off on, like sort of teasingly saying, oh, the Torah doesn't seem to care about exercise. It doesn't seem to care about, taking care of our bodies. And then I tried to make the case that the Torah does very much. That's right. But what the Torah doesn't care about is the kind of thinking around our bodies that I think our culture is often so quick to care about, which is our good looks and our youth and our perfection. That kind of body, the Torah is not so interested in. In other words, the Torah does care about health, but not health as a way of avoiding aging. The Torah is not the characters of the Torah that are imbued with the most holiness are, Moshe and Aaron, who are well into their 80s when they are given these roles. So I do think it's important that there's a different paradigm that the Torah is offering around health, and it doesn't translate into it is important to take care of our bodies, but it's not about being perfectly physically fit or youthful. Do you want to add to that, though?
As we're unfolding it now, it does occur to me that there are laws that relate to the physical well-being of someone who's going to serve as the Kohen.
Yeah.
And various disabilities that would disenfranchise the person from having that role. So maybe in that
right. On that count, I must say you're right. And on that count, I must say that the Torah does not match up well with modern. Look, I have disabled parents myself, and I'm very sensitive to the respect for those with physical disabilities. Like that's that's an ethic I fully embrace, and I think that as a society we are more and more fully embracing. And you're right, the Torah, at least when it comes to the priest, does want someone with a perfectly abled body, a perfectly working body. And yeah, I won't try to justify that. I think it is the case that when it comes to the actual priestly class, there is no tolerance for physical disabilities. That's right, and it may have something to do with the paradigm that I've been setting up. That the part of what it means to have a body that is actually going to enter into the holy space is that it has to be somehow a perfectly working body. And it's very nice to say, well, we all want perfectly working bodies when it comes to, the health or the flowing of our systems. But when it comes to, disabilities or deformities, I think, we have come to understand that a person's inner self is so much more an expression of their holiness than the construction of their body. And in this case, you're right. The Torah seems to go in the other direction. I must concede that. Yeah.
So I probably want to try and reconcile what you just said with the whole discussion of shekels and worth. I do that. That is another pages example in my text.
Yeah.
Bothered me, but it somehow was like
yeah, that's right. I think that what I am trying to suggest about that last text is that it is using a system which is not holy, which is like the buying and selling of human beings based on their work capacity. And it is using them to make the case for a different kind of offering, a way of evaluating yourself as a kind of offering to God. So age is a factor or strength is a factor in the sense that you would be less able to, to labor on behalf of God if you had less strength in your body. But I am suggesting that last chapter is using that language, but trying to shift it into thinking about not the way that you would actually be valued by society, but the way that you would devote your strength to God. I don't know if that's entirely satisfactory, but I do think that it is a better than simply an evaluating of the body and the self on the open slave market. Instead, it's trying to take that sort of thinking and redirect it to God.
A question that I always wondered about, and I agree that our bodies are vesicles, physical
Yeah.
vessels, and are holy. So how we have traditional Jews, we have liberal and progressive Jews. How have the movements have decided if we feel that we are vesicles, that what commandments are important? And obviously there's some commandments we can't do anymore, but there's a lot that we can. How is it decided? You don't have to keep kashrut, or you can drive on Shabbat. I'm not just picking on that, I'm just using those as an example. I always get confused on how that fits.
I do think that this is, look, I have no vote when it comes to denominations. I'm not like advocating for, I think they're all good and they're all bad. So I think we're all just Jews, and I'm not trying to push any particular denomination. But I do think it's interesting to play it out through some of the denominational philosophies. Like, for example, the Reform movement was very clear on embracing the ethical spirit of Judaism and letting go of some of the vestiges of practice or behavior. And I think that one of the things that gets lost in that shuffle is the physicality of Judaism, right? Not just the obligation. And I think there's a debate you could have about how are we obligated, and are we still obligated, and what does it mean that like different communities relate to obligation differently? But I think once you let go of some of those ritualized behaviors, one of the things you lose is the movement of the body. I don't think that Judaism has a great like system of like yoga or exercise, but in a way, I think the system of mitzvot is an incredibly physical system. It presumes a body that is out there to do things in the world. And I think, all I would say is if you live in a paradigm of I'm no longer obligated by the mitzvot, I think we can have that debate, but you still have to ask yourself the question, how will my body be used in my religious life? What role will my body play in my quest for holiness or my service of God?
Why isn't the birth of a baby the most holy event?
Why isn't it? Oh, I think that it is. I mean, I think that the thinking about birth, and maybe the question is, how can you become impure after birthing a baby? Because that seems like birth has led to a state of anti-holiness. Like, how could birth be an impurifying event? And I think the answer to that question is that any closeness to death is treated with great sensitivity and care in the Torah's reckoning. So a birth which inevitably involves a kind of danger puts, like sickness does, like any sort of closeness to death, puts you in a state of recuperation, and you need to go through some kind of purifying ritual to be back in a state of ability to approach the holy spaces. So I think that the first commandment in the Torah is to be fruitful and multiply. It's quite clear that this is a tradition that celebrates birth, but I think the actual process of birth is a dangerous one, and so with any harm that might come to the physical body, Leviticus takes care to try to put some kind of incubation and recuperation as a kind of a way of letting the body come back to its full self, and in this case, the body of the birthing mother.
I guess I thought that when we're talking about impurity, we're talking about spiritual impurity as opposed to physical impurity. And somewhere I read that at that point in time, after the mother has given birth, may well create a sense in the mother. I've never given birth, but in the mother that there's sort of an ego issue that goes with it. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Now, can you expand on that?
Yeah, I think I really appreciate that question. In some ways, that is it's a good place to end, which is to say, of course, the categories of purity and impurity, of holiness and unholiness, so to speak, these are categories that have spiritual meaning, psychological meaning, religious meaning. Our bodies are not chemically impure. Our bodies are not chemically holy. These are religious concepts that we map onto physical processes. Having said that, I think part of what Leviticus is trying to tell us is that there isn't just the body and the mind, the body and the soul, and these are separate realms, but that actually my ability to enter into these, conceptual, psychological, spiritual realms of holiness, of purity, I can't get there unless I have prepared my body as well. So my body is implied by my quest for a spiritual life. And of course, it is the case that the birth rituals have a psychological effect, have a psychological purpose. The giving of an animal itself, as we suggested earlier, if it is a substitute for a body, that's primarily a symbol, a psychological symbol. I should think, this is what Nachmani says, you should think as if I were offering my own body on the altar, but instead I'm offering this animal. That's not, the animal's not actually literally me, it's a psychological replacement. But Leviticus wants to merge the physical experience and the spiritual experience. And I think that the reason that Leviticus does that is because you can't really have a spiritual experience if you are in physical suffering. I mean, this is not, that's too big a statement. Of course, people have spiritual experiences through the greatest of sufferings and horrors. But as a general rule, if I'm aching in my body, I don't have time for God. I don't have time to think about, like, contemplate the mysteries of life. I first have to just take care of my well-being. That's primary. It's like Maslow's hierarchy of needs. First, I have to just be safe and healthy, and then I can begin to contemplate concepts like holiness. But if I try to have a life of holiness and give no thought to my body and the state of my body, have I just come out of the hospital? Did I just have a near-death experience? Am I dealing with like a sore tooth or a sore knee? Well, then I'm going to be thinking about those things, and I have to address that if I'm going to be ready to stand before the Holy One. Yeah, that's a great reference point. The blessing that we give after we go to the bathroom is a good example of, thank God for giving me a working body where everything is flowing correctly, because if I couldn't go to the bathroom, well, you can forget about my relationship with God. That's just not going to be on my mind. Like, I cannot, I have to deal with first things first. And not just first things first, but in Leviticus's picture, there has to be an integration. I have to have like a healthy body in order to have a healthy soul. Yeah.
I think it, I don't know, concerns me, or that maybe I'm just having a hard time following, is there's an arbitrariness to the way Leviticus is treating the body. You should banish the people with skin afflictions. Some is about birth. It's about what you eat. If the point is, there's a big concept here of being healthy, I'm missing it. I don't see where it's saying all these things are in the service of being healthy. It's just saying, do this because God told you to do this.
Yeah.
I don't see the concept behind it. What am I missing?
Yeah, no, you're not missing something. You're identifying something. It is true that there is an arbitrary element. It is true. Like, the seventh day doesn't have to be holy. Could have been the third. Like, there's something, remember, holiness also refers to designation, kind of setting something aside. It's not inherently true that if you build this structure in the shape of the sanctuary, that just always creates holiness. It's holy because at a certain level, because we've designated as holy, and there is something, or God has designated as holy, and there is something arbitrary about that. So some of the particularities of Leviticus, those particularities are about creating a unique, a distinct, a special relationship with God. But I do think the case that I'm making for health is that one of the categories that Leviticus is interested in is disease. And disease is one of the things that renders you incapable of accessing the holy. Now, you're right, the kosher diet isn't necessarily the healthiest diet in the world. And the sexual laws in Leviticus aren't all there to, keep you from STDs. Like, it's not all about health. I think that health is one of the components, and the reference to disease makes that clear. But you might be right in pushing back and saying Leviticus isn't as much concerned with health as it is bodily awareness. But I think eating, sex, disease, reproduction, all of these things imply embodiedness. Whether they all imply health or not, maybe that's putting too much on it, but certainly the concern for disease does put health in that category. Yeah. Yes.
In Jonathan Haidt's work, the Righteous Mind.
Yeah.
He looks at political polarization. Well, we have to go to politics at some point today.
Yeah.
He looks at political polarization. And part of what he's doing over there is he has these 6 innate moral foundations that human use for making moral
Right.
decisions. And one of them is sanctity.
Yeah.
And part of what we also show is that, it's not that liberals and conservatives, one is good and one is evil. It's that we prioritize different values.
Yeah, that's right.
Can you make sense a little bit of how modernity and post-modernity liberals don't value sanctity, perhaps in the same ways that conservatives might, and like how that's tied up with a broader worldview of like, because we talked about a little bit with denomination, but in terms of society, whether it's sanctity of life or sanctity of the body, sanctity of marriage, there's a very different level of conservative discourse now.
Yeah, that's a very big question. I'm interested in what you would think about that, but I think that it's a very interesting dichotomy that Haidt lays out, where he says that conservatives and liberals are different in that they both believe in certain values like freedom, but they don't both believe in other values. Like conservatives are more concerned with loyalty and with sanctity. And I don't know if that's true. In other words, conservatives have their sacred things, their sacred cows, so to speak, like the American flag. But liberals have their sacred things as well. Or liberals, progressives, whatever. The carefulness around language and identity and the terms that we use to refer to people, like those are expressions of sanctity, I think, in the progressive world. I don't think it's true that that progressives don't have their own sacred cows, their own things that are sort of irrationally untouchable because like this just means something to us. It's holy to us. That's just the way it is. Yeah, I don't know if I buy this idea that liberals have left the concept of holiness behind. In fact, I think that one of the reasons that Leviticus is such an important book, even though some of its categories are so foreign to us at this point, is that we all have things that we hold sacred. We all have things that mean something to us, even though they're not inherently valuable or they're not materially valuable, but they are the things that matter. They are the symbols, the cultural artifacts. Liberals, for example, are extremely concerned about the preservation of ancient cultures, indigenous cultures. Why? Why not just say human beings move on, things get lost in the shuffle of time. That's just the way it is. No, it's sacred. Things have become sacred. It's important to preserve each individual's unique experience in the world. It's important that a person's inner sense of self and gender, that's sacred. I guess that's my response, is that I think sanctity is a value that stretches across the conservative liberal divide. And there's interesting thinking to be done about the ways we disagree around what is sacred, but I think we've all got something that is holy to us.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.